It's true. Across the globe, women aren't as prosperous as men. Gender inequality is a pressing moral issue, but we forget it has massive economic implications. If you were to put all of the women who don't have access to formal financial services in one place, they would make up the third largest country in the world. That means an entire population without bank accounts, credit cards, or other tools you and I likely benefit from daily. Prosperity for women starts with inclusive policies, products, and people around the globe, and the investment to make it happen. Welcome to the Making Finance Work for Women podcast. My name is Sonia Kelly, and I lead Women's World Banking's proprietary research division. Join me as I speak with changemakers around the globe to deconstruct the social and economic exclusion women face. We'll discover new evidence together and drive action to accelerate women's economic empowerment. Because a leg up isn't a handout, it's a global game changer. Indeed. Welcome, and thank you so much for tuning into the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, which is streaming on YouTube and available wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on YouTube, you'll be able to find additional insights and resources linked in the description of the video below. I'm the host of the show, Sonia Kelly, and I'm the global head of the Women's World Banking Institute. Now, before we get started, I'd like to give a special shout out to the sponsor of the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, Ernst & Young LLP. EY is a global leader working across assurance, consulting, law, strategy, tax, and transactions. EY teams ask better questions to find new answers for the complex issues facing our world today. You can visit ey.com to explore their latest insights and services. And now let's jump into the show. Today we're going to be discussing a very small topic, the future of finance. Of course, it's not small. We have made remarkable progress in connecting both women and men to the formal financial system for the first time. Just want to run through some numbers of what that has looked like. Account access has increased by 100% in the past 13 years. In 2011, only 37% of women in emerging markets had an account. Now 73% of them have an account at a financial institution or have a mobile wallet. This is amazing. This is like in my professional lifetime, this has happened. Formal savings activity has also more than doubled between 2011 and 2024. Now, women have always saved, but informal savings is expensive. When we look at formal saving numbers, we see that in 2011, only 16% of women in emerging markets had formal savings, but now 36% have formal savings. Most of this growth was in the past 3 years. Women have also gone from having almost no formal payment channels to having many safe ways to move money. Now, a decade ago, only 31% of women in emerging markets used payment instruments, and now 58% of women in emerging markets are actively sending or receiving money. And this last point, payments, seems to be a key component of the success in reaching new market segments and getting to that addressable but underserved market. I remember nearly 20 years ago when I first started out in my career, that famous send money home ad that Kenya's M-Pesa put out. It was an ad with a young man in a city, and he had a job and he wanted to send money home to his mother who was in a rural area. And he took out his mobile phone and he punched in some numbers, and then you could see like the transaction move through the air to the money to the mother who was in a rural area who gets a ping on her phone. Then she's able to go and cash that money out. So like this is sort of the advent of mobile money. Now, since then, payments has become a gateway product. We think of that mother in a rural area who's just going and cashing it out. But what if she keeps a little bit of that money in her account and can use it to pay for things? What if that means, since she has a little bit of money in there, a bank can finally see her and can say, you can have access to credit because we know you have some money and you'll be able to pay it back. Payment infrastructure is really growing up around this market response, with more and more inclusive and instant payment systems driving increased customer engagement. Now, what we know unequivocally is that the financial world is changing right now, and it's changing fast. Economic policy and diverse voices are creating this policy. These are essential to both macroeconomic and microeconomic success that we talk about at Women's World Banking. So, in today's episode, we're joined by David Marsh. He's the chairman and co founder of OMFIF and is one of the most respected voices in European economic policy. David's forthcoming book, Can Europe Survive?, offers a bold and timely examination of a continent at a crossroads, grappling with political fragmentation, economic stagnation, shifting tides of global power. These are things I see on the front page of most newspapers every day. But our conversation today is going to go far beyond geopolitics. We're going to dive into the transformative forces reshaping the financial landscape. Now, I personally am tracking everything from instant payments and central bank digital currencies to things like buy now, pay later platforms and decentralized finance. And our conversation will cover some of those. Innovations are redefining how money moves, who controls it, and who benefits from it. And so that's where our podcast comes in today, our episode comes in, because while the infrastructure of finance is evolving rapidly, the question remains, will it be built for the many or just for the privileged few? As we enter a world in which everyone has a stake in the formal financial system, what are the new opportunities and risks that people need to be aware of? From central bankers to street vendors, the ripple effects of monetary innovation are real and they're just getting started. So I'm looking forward to unpacking what inclusive financial systems could look like in this new era and what it will take to ensure that women, especially those who are historically excluded, aren't left behind. So without further ado, welcome, David. Thanks for joining us today.
No, thank you, Sonia. It sounds like a very interesting conversation that we're preparing here.
It sure is going to be. I've been really looking forward to this. Now, I always like to start our episodes by asking what the origin story is of our guest. Your work spans politics, economics, monetary systems. I think you're a bit of a Renaissance man. Tell me how you came to this space.
It's really curiosity, I would say. I studied chemistry at university. Wasn't really very good at it, and led to a few explosions in the chemistry laboratory. And I'd always been interested in journalism. I became the editor of the university newspaper. So I got into journalism immediately after I left university. And although I've ceased being a journalist 30 years ago, I'm still driven by a desire to find out what's going on. So in the various bits and pieces I've done since then in banking and management consultancy and so on, and now with this institution called OMFIF, we're just trying to find out what's going on in the world and trying to make it comprehensible to people who are our clients and trying to guide them along the path.
And OMFIF, that is the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum. Can you tell me a little bit about how that started?
It was an idea to put together a club of central banks and sovereign funds who often didn't really have much to do with each other, but were all dabbling in each other's markets. Sovereign funds, after all, own a lot of government bonds, and central banks are dealing with government bonds. They're not issuing the bonds. They started buying the bonds, of course, in the last decade. So it was an idea to put together some parts of public finance, which didn't have a huge amount to do with each other, and also to make that comprehensible to the private finance participants who, of course, are dealing with the public finance all the time. They're being regulated by these people, or they're trying to find out what they're doing in terms of their monetary policy, or they are buying bonds or selling bonds with each other. So we're not trying to get into any kind of inside trading or anything like that. We're really trying to build a kind of human software system which allows these people to understand the chemistry of the way they make their decisions in a better way.
That's really interesting. And of course, OMFIF has a gender balance index that they put out annually that I'm going to link to below because I think it's such an important publication that gives us some really good data and some of that data I'll talk through today. Now, I want to ask you a first more substantive question, like building on the fact that your experience spans political, economic, chemistry and financial spheres. I'll be jumping around some of the different challenges I'm seeing in the world. So I'd love for you to consider yourself our oracle today. I'm going to start with your upcoming book, which is coming out next month, Can Europe Survive? It explores the fractures in Europe's economy and politics. And at Women's World Banking, we always start with the lens of women. So I'd love to ask you, from your vantage point, what are you seeing in terms of gender representation and dynamics among decision makers in Europe, in your market?
Well, if you take a step back and look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is where this started, this book, I mean, trying to get into how the Berlin Wall fell, why it fell, and what it led to, you have to say that compared with the old nomenclature of Sovietized Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself, just looking at that fact, it's quite clear that the stature and the status and the influence of women, if you take those two periods, the 40 years before 1989 and the 4 decades since, that stature and that status, they have improved immeasurably for women. Now, you can't say that's simply a result of this happening, but certainly the breaking down of barriers between East and West Europe, it must be thought of as a wholly good thing. And it's led in its path, I would say, to a greater equality between men and women in decision-making parts of the economy, shall we say. And now, of course, it's absolutely essential that there is a better balance in decision-making, whether it's at the helm of a large company or whether it's the helm of a central bank. It is thought of as being a very useful thing to have. Now, often this is an idea that's more honoured in the breach than in the observance, and we could speak about why that is. But I think unquestionably, it is now thought as having diversity, not necessarily having a lot of women and a few men, or you can have too many women as well as too many men. I think it's the diversity that's important, and having different viewpoints and avoiding a herd-like instinct of the sort that we did have, of course, in the Soviet Union and in the Sovietized East Bloc. Too much herd instinct, a lot of old men not knowing what was going on around them.
Yeah, and of course, you've had some very prominent women in financial sector leadership in Europe, not least Christine Lagarde. I understand that they have kind of played a bit of a role in this book. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, Christine Lagarde is just one of the many people that I did go along to see. And clearly, she's played a very important role, both as French finance minister and as the managing director of the IMF, and then as the head of the European Central Bank, where she's been since 2019. And all of these ideas would have been unheard of, shall we say, 40 years ago. It was very much a man's world, such that in the Bundesbank, which was the forerunner in a way of the ECB, they didn't even have a ladies' toilet in the place where they all met on the 13th floor of the Bundesbank, because for 40 years, only men were running the place until a lady did come eventually. Wow. So people, I don't want to personify it too much, but people like Christine Lagarde have been pioneers. I think there would have been another Christine Lagarde had it not been her, but clearly she has played a very important role. And this is not the time to go into all the intricacies of monetary policy. One thing that somebody did say to me in the course of the book, and I did actually bring this in, she made a few mistakes, as you always do at the beginning, but she did admit the mistakes that she made, which this interlocutor said to me, another seasoned central banker, he thought a man wouldn't have done that. So I don't know, you can't, again, generalize, but I do think that sometimes women are refreshingly open and honest about things that they do. And undoubtedly, Christine Lagarde, like other female decision makers, has led to a greater mixity of views and opinions and backgrounds, which I think is wholly salutary.
And of course, we are celebrating historic highs of women heading central banks around the world, but that, quote, historic high is only 16%. And as you said, the goal is gender diversity, of course, so that there are different perspectives around the table when decisions are being made, particularly in this kind of volatile or at least disequilibrium world we're in, with new technology, but also really wild economic signals that we're getting. So tell me a little bit about what gender diversity might mean for policy in the European Union, which everybody's kind of looking to see what they do in this moment.
Well, again, I'd take the focus slightly wider and put it into diversity in general. But of course, it's all very well having diversity. You do need at the centre some sort of general type of figure to bring these things together. And again, one doesn't want to generalize, but it could be that women sometimes are better at drawing together the different fragments and trying not to let egos get too much in the way. I think it's probably not good to just have a few women and lots of men, because that woman might stand out as being a very famous figure. But there's a danger, I think, in loneliness and being somehow exposed as a woman still in a man's world. And you do see that, unfortunately, in the decision-making council of the ECB. You do have two females amongst the 6-person board, but all the 21 governors, there will be 21 at the beginning of the new year when Bulgaria changes and Bulgaria becomes a member of the euro, quite unaccountably, and difficult to imagine really why that is, but the 21 governors of the constituent central banks are all males at the moment, which is really quite rare. Now, it's not something you can just order women to somehow come along and take over those positions. I think at the ECB, they've done a lot to bring along women in senior leadership roles at the ECB, at director general level, and so on within the ECB. You can do that in a single institution, and I think that's been powerful and has been well received and is generally a good thing. Now, amongst the constituents, who are all individual sovereign states, and that in a way is the tragedy of Europe, that the ECB remains a collection of sovereign states. It's not just one single institution. Of course, you cannot order gender diversity to become on the agenda. I think all you can do is to give a greater degree of freedom to people of any gender to rise up through the ranks and become, through genuine effort, meritocracy, hard work, become an aspiring and inspired person who can then possibly lead a central bank, whether men or women. And I think that's what we have to aim for, a freedom of expression, freedom of chance, freedom of opportunity. And over time, that would lead, I'm sure, to more women taking over these roles. But we don't see that at the moment in Europe, for whatever reason.
Yeah, and that's where I'm particularly encouraged. Your report, the Gender Balance Index, says that about half of employees in central banks are women. And so I am hoping that that pipeline leads to more women in senior leadership positions that kind of lead to promotions and give them opportunities. You mentioned fragmentation, and that's something I want to talk about for a minute. That's something that your book focuses on. Tell us more about what fragmentation is, like what you mean when you say that, and then what does it mean for individual consumers?
If you take monetary union, which after all is a very important constituent of today's Europe, even though not all the member countries are in it, there should have been by now, 25 years after the birth of the euro, there should have been less fragmentation. And this clearly does have an effect on consumers as well. This is just not a question for policymakers. It affects consumers. And the reason why this fragmentation is there is because the economies haven't grown together in the way that one had been hoping. The plan had been that you set up a monetary union, and over time, a kind of political union comes along to somehow accompany it. In most countries over the world that have had monetary unions over the last 200 or 300 years, you start off with a political union and then you bind together the constituent states. It becomes a monetary union. In many ways, in 1998, 1999, Europe put the cart before the horse. Monetary union became before political union. But there's a paradox here. The very act of trying to shore up the monetary union after the diverse upsets and squalls we've had have led to greater balkanization of the individual markets. There are now more or less barriers between moving money between countries in a cultural way, more barriers than there were, say, 20 years ago, because in the first 10 years of monetary union, there were actually too many banking movements, which led to some big problems brewing in places like Greece or Italy or Spain or Portugal or Ireland. So the very fact of actually making sure that monetary union survives has led to fragmentation of the banking systems. And this is not good for consumers who want to move money from country to country. There should have been more large banks being set up over the course of time, that will rival American banks. I do think that bigger banks, of course, they can get into trouble and they can all need to be resolved and wound up or whatever. But on the whole, I would imagine that large banks do have a good way of serving their customers. And I think the European citizens would be better served by having a few more large banks that are operating across boundaries. And we've not had that because of what I describe as this balkanization of the banking systems. And just a third point, this so-called capital markets union, which was an idea that was spawned really 10 or 15 years ago to try to bring together the capital markets in Europe in a way that would be helpful for businesses, but also for consumers. That's not happened either, because individual regulatory systems still remain very fragmented and very sovereign and very national. So in all these ways, it's not just the policymakers that I think have let themselves and let other people down. The people have been let down because the fruits of a more unified and more harmonized Europe have not come about.
And it's interesting that that's happening at that like macroeconomic level. At the same time that new technology is coming in at the microeconomic level, like I recently took up a collection for a gift for another staff member at Women's World Banking, and I sent out to my colleagues like I have these 5 different payment mechanisms that I can take. So, like I can take money through my bank and PayPal and Venmo, and like there are, there's M-Pesa, there are so many different ways we can send and receive money between each other. But of course, as you say, there's a limit to that. So there's, first of all, there's not full interoperability between platforms. And then if you're talking about sending money across borders, there are huge challenges and restrictions to that globally, let alone in Europe. And so I just wonder, in this time of increased fragmentation at the kind of geopolitical level and also increased technology, I would love for you to venture a guess. Like, is this going to create barriers to inclusion, barriers to money working for people?
Well, what really creates barriers to money working for people is reduced growth, I think. So that, again, is a wider look at all this. And barriers in payment systems, if you like, come out of the fact that Europe's been on a slow growth path. There's been various measures put into effect to try to shore up monetary union. And this has led to this balkanization that I'm talking about. So the key would be to get growth going again in Europe and to return to something which 20 years ago would have been thought of as a very paltry rate of growth, say 2%. In today's world, that would be a lot. And you see, if growth goes down, say, to between 0.5 and 1%, which is where it is in many countries, this clearly deprives people of opportunities in many ways, women and men together, if you have pressure on employment, for example. So I'd like to put it in a wider context than the payments. That said, there is, of course, a gleam of hope, or you might say also of fear, if you were to have a fully digitalized euro, which is now coming up on the fast stream, the European Central Bank, something that they are trying to put their mind behind, that could lead to, indeed, to more effective inter-country payment systems. The reason why this has come up, I think, in the last few months is because there is some fear that through President Trump espousing the stable coin regime in the United States, this is an attempt, really put very simply, to somehow colonize the whole stream of world money and to drive it into the dollar in order to fund America's exorbitant budget deficits. And so the Europeans are pushing back here and are really revving up, accelerating the idea of moving towards a digital euro. Now, I don't want to overpromise here because there would have to be some limits to the use of the digital euro. Otherwise, the traditional banks would get afraid that they're going to be deprived of their livelihood. But that could be, I think, a useful way, A, of trying to make money more fungible across European borders, and B, creating a more stalwart and sovereign European banking and finance system to stand up to what looks like a very powerful rival in the shape of the United States. There is this battle going on for world savings. There's a lot of world savings around, and Mr. Trump wants to collar them for himself, and the Europeans are pushing back on that.
Okay, those are really spicy comments. I love this conversation, David. Um, You know what, you're kind of getting into this realm that I did want to talk about, which is CBDCs. Central banks are experimenting with central bank digital currencies it's a way to maintain control of a changing system, but there are real risks of central bank digital currencies and opportunities for ordinary people. So I would love for you to put on your microeconomist hat for a second. Like, what could CBDCs mean for like a woman running a small business in an emerging market, for example?
Yes, well, to the extent that a euro might be a fungible currency, which you could use in Kenya or India, somewhere like that, it should help enormously with trade and investment, even at a small scale in those countries. So you might have a supplier or you might have a customer in Düsseldorf, and you might be sitting in Bangalore, and you'd be able to trade with them and carry out currency transactions with them as easily as you might with somebody in your own hometown. I mean, that would obviously be a tremendous boon. It would help overcome some of the fragmentation we've been talking about and some of the deglobalization trends that we've been talking about. And I think that's the kind of thing that could happen. It would only be relatively small scale, but it would help this microeconomy that you're talking about. Within Europe itself, there is some talk that retail transactions in the digital euro, which I'm sure will come about in the next few years, should be limited to only 3,000 euros, because there's this fear that if there were a greater amount, it would draw savings away from the traditional banks. It would not only affect their own livelihoods amongst the banks, which could then have knock-on effects for the wider economy, but it could also possibly lead to financial stress if there were a problem with a bank or a perceived problem that might be affecting a banking system. Consumers, if they had the ability to move it all into central bank money, might carry out a run on the bank, like we saw with the Silicon Valley Bank, pile it all into digital currencies, which is safe as houses because it's at the ECB. So there are these problems which you alluded to, Sonia, which means that you cannot carry out this system overnight. Again, I would try to put this in a wider context and say, if we can try to reverse some of this rather fatal move we see towards deglobalization and defragmentation and fragmentation in trading markets, and let's be honest, there are some glints of hope there. If we can overcome those trends, then I think the move towards properly borderless inter-country transfers through digital currencies will become that much more part of a worldwide trend, and it will be aligned more with what's going on in the world. And you do see glimmers of hope here, because America may be trying to cut itself off in different ways through tariffs and such measures, but you do see other countries, for instance, Indonesia and the European Union, a big trade agreement there. Britain is doing its best as a little island now, no longer part of the EU, with the trade agreement with India and so on. So you do see these ideas to try to push back against the forces of deglobalization. And I do think that a digital currency in its own way could play a role there. And yes, I do think that would be helpful for consumers in different parts of the world, not just in our Europe, but also in developing countries that Europeans may be trading with.
And now, a word from our sponsor. EY applauds Women's World Banking's 45-year legacy empowering women through financial inclusion. Together, we have a common vision to build a better financial services industry, one that is stronger, fairer, and more sustainable. Find out more on ey.com. So a lot of hope there, but also things that we need to watch out for in the process of making it happen. And I hadn't considered those unintended consequences that you mentioned as well, kind of in the interim, and making sure, I mean, there will always be losers when there are big economic or policy or geopolitical changes, and trying to make sure that fallout is not a structural risk, and that there is place for competition to happen. I think those were really important points too. At Women's World Banking, we've observed that women are often the last to benefit from financial inclusion. Are there other structural shifts? We've already talked about a few, but other structural shifts, whether in policy or infrastructure or incentives, to ensure women are not just included, but prioritized in this new financial era as valid and even profitable customers for financial institutions, but also important economic forces for economies?
I think a lot of this boils down to education. So clearly, the more you can teach kids at school about the value of economics, I'm not saying that everybody has to be trained to be a businessman or a businesswoman. I don't think that would be right at all. But I think people need to realize the virtues of solid money, shall we say, and also that the heaven doesn't grow without some effort being made into it, if I can put it like that. I think women can play their role in areas like that. Now, I think it's very important also to have role models. That's not an original thought, but that is very important. So whether women who are becoming heads of various undertakings, for example, in Germany, where I'm talking to you from today, we've just heard about a lady being now the head of the Deutsche Bahn, the railway system.
Hmm.
Now, it's possibly not a very good time for anybody to take over the Deutsche Bahn because it does seem to be going through a particularly bad period. But if she can really pull the cart out of the mud at the moment, then that, of course, she'll be a tremendous role model for other people to follow. There's lots of successful women in lots of spheres, not just in Europe, in other parts of the world. So I think without overdoing it, one has to really extol that success and to make sure that not just as a woman, but as a human being, we're learning something from those examples. Now, one of the people clearly figuring in my book, but also figuring in European history, is Angela Merkel. And of course, she is worthy of study because she was the first person hailing from East Germany to become the chancellor, the prime minister of Germany. That's never happened before. And of course, she was the first woman as well. And she was in power for 16 years, the same amount of years as Helmut Kohl, possibly her more famous predecessor, who also came from the Christian Democrat Union. So a study of Angela Merkel, not suggesting we do that now, Sonia, a kind of psychoanalytical study. How has she forced her way up in a man's world in quite a brutal fashion, actually, in lots of ways? Women do sometimes have to be quite relentless, clearly. That would be a worthy study to put her into perspective, maybe to compare her with Helmut Kohl, who
Mm.
helped her a great deal over that time. It's quite clear that women do need mentors and people who can help them, whether men or women. In this case, Kohl did help her, and in the end, it was she who somehow, in a slightly brutal way, did take over from him as well. It just shows that these things can sometimes go about in ways that cannot be foreseen beforehand. I just think, as I said, education of women, but also education about women in a man's world, putting all these things into a kind of forensic study, I think would be very helpful, and something
Mm.
maybe that your organisation could drive forward. I think scientific dissertations on all this, they're not the be all and end all, but I think they'll be very, very powerful tools.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if somebody's listening and is a PhD candidate, this is a great topic for you. It'd be, be a real win, and could be something that could be anthropological or an international relations or political science dissertation. So, if anyone's listening and they end up pursuing this, I'd love to hear it. This
I would love to
comparison.
see a study, I have to say, of Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, and Christine Lagarde. A really good scientific study that didn't have too much about personality. It was really looking at these backgrounds, the way they made their way in a man's world. Their techniques, what they did, what they didn't do, the
Mm.
mistakes they made as well. I think that would be a worthwhile subject of study, and I'm sure it will have a huge readership. It was properly well done.
Yeah, I would read that for sure.
There's one reader straight away for you.
There's me, yeah, and there's you too. I just read the, Eleanor Roosevelt biographies too. I mean, like, I love these pictures of really formidable women, um, but just from that perspective of, like, as you said, like, not, not, like, gossipy or not, kind of the salacious story, but that sort of
There's another one.
systematic. Yeah.
I mean, if I may interrupt, I do
Tell
remember
me.
reading, I can't remember the name of the author, which is disgraceful, but a wonderful book about the three women at Yalta, who were, I think, Churchill's daughter and must have been Roosevelt's daughter, and exactly who the other one was, I can't remember now. But the three women who were there as very important people assisting the presidents. There must have been somebody connected with Stalin as well. Sometimes it's the women who are not actually in the limelight who do play the biggest role. We all know about that. So it's not just the Christine Lagardes and the Mrs. Thatchers
Mm.
and the Angela Merkels of the world. Sometimes it's the unsung heroines. So that's a book which has already come out some years ago. Things like that, I think stories do need to be told.
Yeah, and that's Anna Roosevelt, Sarah Churchill, and Kathleen Harriman.
Kathleen
And the
Harriman, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and the book is The Daughters of Yalta by Catherine Grace Katz. Yeah, also highly recommend that book. I think it was on a syllabus when I was at university.
Thank
So
you for
yeah.
remembering. I thought there was something connected with Stalin. I obviously got that wrong.
Oh, I Googled it. I
Well
didn't
done.
remember
Yeah.
to look it
Your
up.
Google memory is extremely good, Sonia.
Yeah, my Google sidekick here. Well, I'd love to ask one final question, and this is sort of the magic wand question. If you could wave a magic wand, and that is like if you could leave policymakers and financial leaders who are our audience here, if you could leave them with one imperative for building a monetary system that works for everyone, from street vendors to sovereign wealth funds, what would it be?
It would certainly be to spend more time talking to ordinary people.
Mm,
Maybe it means just not having so much sleep, because I know these people do work quite hard, and you need to go out in the street incognito. One of the problems these days is that the central bankers themselves are quite well known, and so they cannot go out talking to ordinary people, mingling with people in a pub or in a street market, because they are celebrities and they're surrounded by people wanting to take photos of them or sometimes
mm,
doing horrid things to them. So they need to be surrounded by burly security guards. So I really do think that getting closer to the people would be incredibly helpful. I'm not saying that's going to be a panacea. They do tend to wrap themselves up. I'm not blaming them for that. They have to do that by people who are professionals in the financial markets or other politicians. And so, if we could wave a magic wand, you need to put on a mask, you need to put on a wig, you need to put on some kind of disguise, and just go to a street market and go to a pub. Now, probably Christine Lagarde, who may well be listening to this, she'd probably tell us that she does do that, and she goes into a local place somewhere in France, and people don't know who she is.
mm,
So, Christine, tell us if that's what you do. But I do think that, in general, closeness to the people would be very helpful. It would be necessary, but not sufficient.
mm. Thank you so much, David. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I so appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Christine Lagarde, if you are listening, let us know your secret for talking to ordinary people and remaining incognito and how you get that input. I'm leaving with some book recommendations and I'm going to stick them in the chat, not least of which is David's new book, which I'm really looking forward to it coming out next week. And so you can pre-order that in the link in the chat there. Also, I have this recommendation written down, talk to ordinary people. I think that's an important recommendation for anyone working in the financial sector, whether you are the head of a central bank or somebody designing a product in a payment company. I also have this note that big economic geopolitical changes have big microeconomic impacts. We talked about how a change in Europe might mean a change for a woman trader in Kenya. That's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about policy. As we've heard today, the future of finance is being written right now by those of you who are listening, in fact, from instant payments to digital currencies to new consumer tools. But innovation alone doesn't guarantee inclusion. And if the underlying systems aren't designed with women in mind, we really risk leaving millions behind. So that's why at Women's World Banking, we're working towards a bold goal for 2035 that every country has a national digital ID system that tracks women's enrollment, driving a 20% increase in women's use of digital payments. Big, ambitious goals. And now the future of finance can already be found in corners around the globe built on inclusive and secure digital infrastructures. Powered by safe payments, it's delivering measurable returns and moving us from access to empowerment for all. And that's the next transition we're talking about. I talked at the beginning about how we've seen immense access to the financial system, but the next movement is going to be making sure that access really works for people. Don't get left behind in this transition. Help us shape a future where finance works for everyone. You can reach out to me directly at sk@womensworldbanking.org if you're interested in partnering with Women's World Banking on this. I love giving out my email. I'm happy to give it out on the podcast, and I'm really happy to receive feedback on how we might do this and who we might partner with. Now, if you found today's discussion valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to it, to rate it, to share it with your friends or colleagues, and to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback really matters. We read all of it, and it helps us to bring you content that resonates. So please stay engaged, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.